So we've moved on. We've gotten our content understood. We looked at the data. We're actually creating a hierarchy based on what we've learned about that data of maybe what is an important or less important field in that data table. And so what we're going to do with our lives is we're going to spend 80 to 90% of our time in this world. The world of just trying to make sense of things and giving context to data. Because we spend so much time here, there's a lot of variety of how to go about the next step, which is, as the information architect, you've got a topic and you might have been looking and should have been looking for very controlled vocabulary words, such as, in my example, I'm doing music, and that might be best represented by genre. But there can be other ways to organize music. It just happens to be that many things in our lives have been given a meaning by the fact that it's been described, and there's a language around describing the different kinds of things that we might encounter. I'm starting with this only because in this example, because I'm not that good at other languages, I do recognize one thing, but I start to then recognize that the other things are related. They're all ways to say, in a sense, the same thing. So you're looking for groupings and things that pull things together, and that gives us a higher level to be able to explore, so each individual record isn't unique and that you don't have to spend that much time. You can actually go through massive amounts of data without having to focus just on that, each one by one by one. The world that this comes from is well thought through. The library science is one, how to classify books and topics around books. But even in any of those, they don't necessarily embrace the computerized way that data is being captured and organized and regurgitated or given out and given value in context. So a really good example is why Google caught on, is that you're giving it a context, such as a phrase or a question or something like that, and it's able to go through a fairly massive amount or in fairly good amount of data and give a ranked order of the things that may or may not apply to that. So that taxonomy of how did it find that out is the topic that we're just going to brush upon as an information architect. Because the first job is, of course, to just make sure that you do the best you can to make sure that the language being used to organize your data is understandable to others. So, we could start with just a little bit of history. I like to bring up Linnaeus just because it's good to know that, again, this has been going on forever. Linnaeus was the one who was able to come up with a series of words that described all of the animal kingdom. And so this particular grouping and the concepts behind it and the nomenclature, or the words that were used, were there so that people could talk about the same thing. It's really valuable, right? You don't want to be just constantly defining terms. You want to get past that, and you want to start to be able to understand, hey, in these particular groupings, there's differences and there's similarities, and so that we can actually focus on the things that are more important and the discussion we want to have. And we're going to see these structures everywhere. This set of words, for example, many are familiar with because an information architect came up with this and was able to take the data that was being captured and made sure that it fit in one of these particular categories. Do these categories have any deeper meaning? Well, I think they come and go. Some may be really popular and some may not. So some things make sense in these words here. In terms of hierarchy, you can start to see the big pictures up here. What are the things that this site handles? And then underneath it are subcategories. And so just with music, I was in this particular diagram, this might not have everything, but it does have a fair amount of detail about what is a classification organizational wording that could help us just get started. So for example, I like music. Great. And by the way, I have a database filled with a couple million examples of music. Which one would you like? So you're trying to get a concept between the person and their interest in music, which could be an interested in automobiles. Then you'd say, well, okay, there's now a wholly different set of words that might help us have a conversation to get more to the specifics. Because saying I like music too, doesn't really lead anywhere. So in this case, these are just some words that people have made up. Some of the bigger words might be more helpful, although organic pop rock isn't probably a term that people would use. So there's always going to be quirks around every taxonomy, but most likely you're going to find a set of words that for any topic that you could ever come up with, unless it's a brand new concept, that you can start to have a classification system, and that can start helping you build an ultimate way for someone to find something in your database, which is where we're going to go. So we've got this set of data. We're trying to get this onto the page, and we're trying to find these bigger and smaller words. So you're going to start with some research. Just made some bread today, so it made me think of different kinds of bread. And if you go through this just as a quick research project, you will start to see lots of ways that there's usually a very, very high level, and the low level can be probably needs more thought and more, it takes more expertise to come up with a lower level. I know there's types of beer, which is much like bread, which can go way beyond what many people would be able to use to relate their experience. They might say, I have a beer, but I'm not sure what type, and I certainly might not be able to match it to some of these descriptors. So you have to be a little bit careful about sort of sub-hierarchies. And within e-commerce, one thing too is to just start to manage a little bit more of, well, how do you represent things? And this is, I think, where visual representation is going to be pretty powerful, since a picture does convey many more things than just a topic. So just like with music, I could talk about salsa music, but playing salsa music is probably going to have much stronger connection than saying that word. So I'm very much a fan of doing rather than talking. So how do you do some of the things and get some practice in getting your ideas or your taxonomies to help organize large groups of information? And one example I'm going to show here is something that Apple and Microsoft to some extent have been struggling with forever, which is how to organize all the files on your computer. And one thing I did really appreciate is they keep trying and trying and trying. And even though there are so many things under the hood, like for example, this tagging interface, tags are kind of an essential idea. A tag, for example, could be those genres we were just talking about. That could be the tag or the controlled vocabulary we want to use to describe these sorts of things. But one thing that may suffer from, computers suffer from, is some relationships that aren't particularly intuitive. For one, there's a concept of, and let's just take a look here. These concepts, in many ways, are also baked into what's called an operating system. An operating system is just a database structure, just like we're talking about, that takes all of this data and figures out the right place and the right structure so that it can be used when needed. So a computer in itself is a massive information architecture example. And so let me show you some of those examples. So we just talked about tags, which I don't believe anyone uses, but there's always hope that one could finally take the time to go in and tag a file, such as this particular screenshot, and say that this particular screenshot really is about information. Super. Once that's done, and by the way, you might have seen another thing, which is that it tends to not like two words. Computers are weird. Let's just put it that way. So it might have one tag for information, the other for architecture. But that being said, now wherever this file may be, I can go in and then now search for information or architecture or both, and a group of those files will all come up no matter where they are. And the power of that is understandable because as we all may have thousands upon thousands pieces of information, how do you find it again becomes harder and harder the more you have and the less organized it is. We can understand by some of these things like titles that they're just not that helpful. Sometimes we're just not good and or thorough enough or consistent enough to title things in a way that are going to be helpful. So the minute you see a title, and this can be very true within work environments, a title might have series of numbers, then it would have a name, and then it would have a version, and then it would. So once you start to see those long titles, what you're really seeing is what we're trying to accomplish now, which is a controlled vocabulary in a controlled order, and you're trying to build a database, in a sense, out of a title. You don't have to do that. Unfortunately, it doesn't make it easy in the end that sorting, which is what we're doing here, if you sort by any of these ideas, the sort by title often isn't also sorting by importance or helping you find things later. So anytime you see a controlled vocabulary, you're really trying to build a database, which is something that file systems have just been innately clumsy at doing. And where the web has shined is its abstraction abilities, that it really does have to keep a table, and it's not dealing with as many file types. But you've started to see some of the cracks in the pavement when it comes to images. Images can have very strange names to them. But this is where the world of computers and humans are going to actually hopefully intersect, where computers are getting better at recognizing things within an image, which means they can apply a taxonomy, sometimes incorrectly, but still better than nothing, to a meaningless image name. But that's a more advanced topic. What I wanted to get at is this structure. Applications are things that do things. Downloads, I guess, are things that come from somewhere that you get someplace else. And then the rest of these words are up to you. Desktop, we talked before, is a concept that may or may not make any sense, but it's just a place to put things, and you sort of know where it is because it is visible to you. That's about it. It's visible behind these things. So let's take a look at some different data structures and some different words. I'd like to also call these all nouns, because we're in our next topic. Once we've figured out the nouns, we're going to figure out some verbs. And you'll have fun with that. So verbs are where you do something with it. This is just how do you group them together. Fortunately, we see here this is about coding. And these particular words all have meanings. These are programming languages. Or not, I guess, HTML and CSS or something, GitHub, Angular. So what you're able to do is to use these to sort through and find different things easily, because the name, the image, any of that may not be particularly useful about what does this mean and what do they have to offer you. Some of the particular descriptions can also be more regular, such as location is a really interesting field, which is a controlled vocabulary, but not entirely, because it would require a lot more fields. Certainly require at least a city and state, and probably zip code, which is another concept brought on to make things understandable in this world, that you've got a zip code and then you've got a more specific zip code that was added later. So you can start to see all these are just concepts so that we all are able to speak the same language and talk about something specifically so that we're not constantly having to go through and organize. By the way, you can start to see how a tool like Airtable is going to help you easily view and just double check that these are useful as categories. In this case, these are content types for digital content. Some may come and go, and some may not be permanent, but it always, I do like that you can go through and see other people's attempt at Airtable to build data structures and look at the kind of words that they might use. The goal now is to look at your data and find existing taxonomies that already exist, that people, and words that they're pretty clear about, so that you can say, okay, now I can check, make sure my data has this ability either to enter or to enforce, that we need categorization so that you can then design an experience for them to find things later. There's a, in the topic that I'm tackling right now, which is music, obviously there's genres, and yet genres are not terribly helpful, such as rock. Not a helpful genre, because you're looking at a category that could consist of hundreds, millions of examples. And when you have millions, you're not really helping anyone find it, because then what is the secondary way you're going to sort? So if I say I want a rock record, do you start with AC/DC because it starts with A? Things like that become a problem. So you might need sub-genres. We talked about that a minute ago. So sub-genres are helpful. You also can see these, what I call idiosyncratic genres. And I do think that in terms of movies and music, this is kind of a real creative area for an information architect to determine maybe, again, something that's not quite obvious, or just a way to continually build out a tertiary sort of organization, nomenclature or words around something that isn't as solid as maybe a genre and a subgenre. And when you get into genres and subgenres, you can see here some examples of some of the bigger genres. But as you get into subgenres, those can come and go and or be redefined or reintroduced without having to make a huge change in your basic taxonomy. So if this is genre, subgenre, this would be a tertiary genre, meaning it's more about a mood, for example, or it's a combination of things. And within music, one of the great pioneers in this was Pandora, which hired musicians to actually go in and listen to a lot of music and really come up with very, very distinct categorization ideas. And while each person may be more and more idiosyncratic over time, they were able to kind of even out and find that some aspects of just orchestration or instrumentation or other things really helped when someone said they liked a particular tune, to find more tunes like that. And that more likely is being done programmatically now, but it still might involve humans, and they came up with a classification system. I will state that there's as we mentioned the word taxonomy or nouns, as I'm also referring to them, there's ways, like concrete ways of describing something. There's also folksonomies, which means that I want to label this as trip folk, and you might want to call it folk rock. The distinctions between the two may not be meaningful, except that as many more people try to describe things, sometimes the wisdom is in the room, and people together can describe something more completely if you allow them to. And so an interface concept for here is the idea of a big text box where you start to type and it'll auto-complete with something that is known. And then if it's unknown, it'll allow you to enter that concept, and maybe the concept might go through some sort of vetting or some process of review. However, that can be a really valuable thing as people are trying to build playlists or other ways to organize what they consider to be important about music. So don't underestimate the fact that you don't have to do this all yourself, but you want to be aware of and understand the history of your topic, whatever that may be, and do the research necessary so that you're speaking the right language to not reinvent the wheel, which is extremely important in information architecture. You are almost always going to rely upon the tried and true and the controlled and understood before you go and invent. That being said, the next lecture, once you've gotten this right, is about invention, and we're calling it verbs, and that's going to be about navigating the information. How do you get around it? How do you move through it? So those are new sets of words. So words this week, words moving forward.